Today I'll be talking to you all about acute gingival infections. So to start with, what are these acute gingival infections and why are we even studying them as a complete separate clinical entity? Now these acute gingival conditions are basically the clinical conditions that have a rapid onset involving the gingiva and they may be present with some amount of discomfort or pain. Now because of this reason, they require urgent attention. And if they are left unattended, they might cause rapid destruction of the tissue. So, prompt diagnosis and treatment are required in these conditions to prevent destruction of the periodontal tissue. Again, these lesions can be localized or they may be generalized and they may present with or without systemic manifestations. So, what are the various acute gingival conditions? They are ANUG, that is acute necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis, primary herpetic gingivostomatitis, and pericoronitis. Remember, abscess is also present with acute symptoms, but I have not included them in my presentation today. So what is acute necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis? Now this is an inflammatory destructive disease of the gingiva which is of microbial origin that occurs most often in impaired host. Remember here, impaired host is important because just the mere presence of the bacteria will not cause the disease. It requires an impaired host. It manifests with characteristic clinical signs of necrosis and sloughing of the gingival tissue and may be accompanied by systemic symptoms. So going back to the history, now this was first recognized in the 4th century BC by Xenophon. Now he found out that the Greek soldiers there were affected with sore mouth and foul smelling breath, but he didn't know what it was. Then in 1774, John Hunter described the clinical findings of this and he differentiated it from scurvy. Then in 1886, Hirsch, who was a German pathologist, described some of the systemic manifestations of this clinical infection. He said that there were enlarged lymph nodes, fever, malaise and increased salivation associated with this infection. Then finally, in 1890, Plot and Vincent described the disease and said that this is caused by fusiform bacilli and spirochetes. Now this infection has various names and it is important for you all to at least know few of these names because in your exam they can ask any of these names and ask you all about the infection. So the various synonyms are Vincent's infection, acute ulceromembranous gingivitis, trench mouth. Now trench mouth was given, the name was given during the World War I when the army people were living in those trenches and that time they found that all those people living in the trenches had this infection. That's when they gave the name trench mouth. The other names are ulcerative gingivitis, Vincent's stomatitis, fusospirally gingivitis, pseudomembranous angina, spirochetal stomatitis, etc. So now what will the patient come with a history of? Now patient will come to you and say that this infection was of sudden onset or he'll tell that he had an episode of any debilitating disease or acute respiratory tract infection in the near past. Also, he might give a history of change in living habits, excess work with inadequate rest, poor nutrition, tobacco use, and psychological stress. So when you start doing the clinical examination, what are the clinical signs you will look for? So you will see that there is a punched out crater-like depression at the crest of interdental papilla, subsequently which extends to the marginal gingiva and rarely to the attached gingiva. You will see that this surface of the gingival crater is covered by a grey pseudomembranous slough which is demarcated from the rest of the gingival mucosa by a linear erythema. Now in some cases, this pseudomembranous slough will be denuded and the underlying gingival margin can be seen which is red, shiny and hemorrhagic. The characteristic lesion may progressively destroy the gingiva and the underlying periodontal tissue. Spontaneous gingival hemorrhage and pronounced bleeding after slightest stimulation are additional characteristic clinical signs. Remember, this is a differentiating feature here because a normal chronic periodontitis patient will have bleeding but he won't have it won't be spontaneous, you have to probe it. Here there will be spontaneous bleeding. Okay, that is the most characteristic differentiating feature. The other signs which are found are fetid odor and increased salivation. Next, here is an important MCQ. Remember, NUG can never progress to periodontal pocket. Why? See now periodontal pockets are basically because of the apical migration of junctional epithelium. Okay, so now for junctional epithelium to migrate apically, the cells have to be viable. But in NUG, these cells become necrotic. So once they become necrotic, they cannot move apically. Hence, NUG can never progress to periodontal pocket. But again, these periodontal pockets can already be present on which NUG is superimposed. Like there is periodontal pocket upon which the acute necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis has occurred. Okay, so that can happen, but NUG can never ever progress to periodontal pocket. So those are the signs. Now what are the symptoms the patient will complain of? The patient will tell that there is extreme sensitivity to touch and also the patient will say that there is radiating gnawing pain which is intensified by eating spicy or hot food. He'll also tell that there is a metallic foul taste and the patient will say that there is a pasty saliva which has increased in the near past. Coming to extraoral and systemic signs and symptoms, patients are usually ambulatory and have a minimum of systemic symptoms. However, there might be local lymphadenopathy and slight elevation in temperature in mild and moderate stages of the disease. But in severe cases, there might be high fever, increased pulse rate, leukocytosis, loss of appetite, and general lassitude. So coming to the clinical course, that is, how does this ANAG start and proceed? So here you have to remember two stages, okay? First is pin box staging. Second is Cohen and Horning staging. And here most of your MCQs will lie. So first is the pin box staging, okay? So how does this ANAG progress and start? Like start and progress. So in pin box stages, stage 1, here there is involvement only at the tip of interdental papilla. In stage 2, there's marginal gingiva. Stage 3, this attached gingiva is also affected, and in stage 4, bone is also exposed. Coming to Cohen and Horning staging. Stage 1, there's necrosis only at the tip of papilla. Stage 2, there's necrosis of the entire papilla. Stage 3, there is necrosis involving the marginal gingiva. Stage 4, necrosis extending into the attached gingiva. Stage 5, necrosis extending into buccal or labial mucosa. Stage 6, necrosis exposing the alveolar bone. And stage 7, necrosis will be perforating the skin of cheek. Now, here there is an important MCQ. Now, they might ask you, so now when NUG progresses, it will cause destruction of the periodontium. Now, that is known as necrotizing ulcerative periodontitis. Now, when that progresses and it goes beyond the mucogingival junction, it is called as necrotizing stomatitis, okay? Now, when that progresses and it involves the cheek, the skin, the labial mucosa, the bone, entire thing, that is known as NOMA, okay? That is how NUG progresses. So, now the important MCQ here is, they'll ask you, what stages in Cohen and Horning, what stage in Cohen and Horning staging are NUG or are NUP or are necrotizing stomatitis? So here you have to remember that stage 1 is NUG, stage 2 and 3 can be NUG or NUP, okay? Stage 4 is definitely NUP, stage 5 and 6 is necrotizing stomatitis, and stage 7 is NOMA. Okay, so you have to remember this. This is how your MCQ will be asked. Next, going to the etiology. So there are two main things, okay. One is the role of bacteria and one is impaired host system, as I already said. So role of bacteria, as I said, Plot and Vincent were the ones who discovered that this is caused by fusiform bacillus and a spirochetal organism, okay. After this, Loesch came and he said there are two things. One is there's constant flora, okay, and there is something called variable flora. Now he said that the constant flora is composed of Prevotella intermedia and fusiform bacillus and spirochetal organisms. Okay. Addition, there is something called variable flora which consists of other microorganisms. Then what they found is when metronidazole was given to these patients, there was a reduction in these organisms. Okay. That's when they realized that this infection is mainly caused by anaerobic members. Okay. Also they found that there was an increased antibody titers for medium-sized spirochetes and Prevotella intermedia in these patients. Coming to role of host response. Now, regardless of whether specific bacteria were implicated in the etiology of ANAG, as I said, presence of an impaired host is necessary. Now, what they found is just, when they took the bacterial exudate and put it in another animal or human, they found that the same symptoms or clinical signs were not seen in another organism. Okay, but when the other organism had some amount of local or systemic immunosuppression and then these bacteria were inoculated, then the patient had ANAG. That's when they found out that an impaired host is necessary for this infection to occur. So coming to what are the predisposing factors, okay. So when they were studying about the predisposing factors, initially a lot of studies were done only in the army people, okay. When they were studying about these people, they found that at one time, a lot of people were getting this infection. So first they thought maybe it is a contagious infection, that's why all the people in that area at once are getting it. But later when they did a lot of studies, they found that they were not contagious, okay. So what are the predisposing factors which are causing this infection to occur? So when they started studying the lifestyle of the army people, they found three main important factors. One is there has to be increase in psychological stress. There has to be increase in physical demand, and there is a decrease in nutritional intake. So these were the common findings in all the army people who had got this infection. That led to the finding or discovery of the predisposing factors. Now the predisposing factors, when they later studied, they classified them as local and systemic. Now, local factors are two types, okay? One, contributing to the accumulation of bacteria, such as poor oral hygiene, overhanging margins and restoration, food impaction, malpositioning of teeth, calculus, and contributing to local ischemia, that is cigarette smoking. Coming to the systemic factors, they are systemic diseases, nutritional deficiency, emotional stress, and hormonal imbalance. So let's talk about local factors. Now, although this ANAG might occur in disease-free mouth, it is most often superimposed on a pre-existing chronic gingival disease or periodontal pocket. Now, what happens is when there is a presence of deep periodontal pocket and pericoronal flap, it favors a favorable environment for these bacteria to proliferate. Okay, so all these bacteria come and accumulate in the periodontal pocket and pericoronal flap, causing the formation or resulting in ANAG. Also, areas of gingiva traumatized by the opposing teeth and malocclusion, such as the palatal surface or behind the maxillary incisors and the labial surface of the mandibular incisors, may predispose to NAG. Now, these traumatized area again cause or are responsible for a favorable environment where the bacteria can proliferate. Coming to cigarette smoking. Now, what happens during cigarette smoking? Now, cigarette smoking causes the nicotine, which is present in the cigarette, will cause the release of epinephrine. Okay. Now, these epinephrines are responsible for vasoconstrictions. Okay. Now, because of vasoconstriction, there is localized ischemia, which is causing necrosis. Okay, that's how cigarette smoking causes ANAG. So, the epinephrine will cause vasoconstriction, which is responsible for decrease in blood flow, causing ischemia and necrosis. Coming to systemic factors, there are alterations in lymphocyte population and function, which are seen in various diseases such as malignancy, systemic lupus erythematosus, von Willebrand's disease, drug-induced agranulocytosis, HIV, and AIDS. Alterations or impairment of neutrophil functions, such as Shibuya-Higashi syndrome, lazy leukocyte syndrome, Papillon-Lefebvre syndrome, hypophosphatasia, Down syndrome, diabetes mellitus. Now, all these systemic diseases will predispose to the formation of ANAG because either they have alteration in lymphocyte population or they have an impairment of neutrophil function. So, how does nutritional deficiency cause ANAG? Now, nutritional deficiency or malnutrition will impair the innate and adaptive defense mechanism. Okay. Also, we know that the junctional epithelium or any epithelium per se, the interepithelial space is filled with integrins and cadherins. Now, integrins and cadherins are protein in nature. Okay, they are responsible for cell-to-cell adherence. Okay, now when there is a protein malnutrition, when there is less protein, this intercellular junction is impaired. Okay, so the there are spaces between the epithelium which increases the epithelial permeability. Okay. Also, they say that vitamin C deficiency causes increase in sulcular epithelial permeability and also causes impairment of polymorphonuclear leukocyte function. So, this way, nutrition deficiency causes ANAG. So, what is it? One is nutritional deficiency will impair the innate and adaptive defense mechanism. Also, the intercellular junctions or the intercellular proteins which are responsible for adherence of the epithelial cells, that is integrins and cadherins, are basically made of proteins. Now, when there is protein deficiency, there is deficiency of this integrin and cadherin, which cause in the attachment of the cells, which causes separation of the cells following increase in sulcular permeability. Now, how will emotional stress cause ANAG? Now, what happens during emotional stress is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis is activated. That causes increase in release of corticosteroids. Now, these corticosteroids will cause decrease in polymorphoneutrophil chemotaxis and also phagocytosis. So, because of this reason, emotional stress causes impaired immune function, causing ANAG. Now, describing the entire etiological mechanism and sequelae. So, psychological stress and anxiety, as I said, will cause increased corticosteroid production, which will cause immune suppression by decreasing the polymorphoneutrophil chemotaxis and phagocytosis. Thus, if the immunity is reduced or there is immune suppression, there will be increased bacterial growth and invasion, causing necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis. Also, if there is pre-existing gingivitis or periodontal pocket, which will harbor the bacterial growth and invasion, causing necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis. Deficient nutrition will also cause immune suppression, causing necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis. Now, necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis will slowly lead to necrotizing ulcerative periodontitis and stomatitis. Coming to histopathology, again an important MCQ here. You have to remember who gave the histopathology of ANAG, that is Lysgarten's 4 zones, okay? Now, Lysgarten gave 4 zones. They are bacterial zone, neutrophil rich zone, necrotic zone, and spirochetal infiltration zone. Now, these zones are from the surface towards, like into, it's going inside. So, what you have to remember here is, as we go from the bacterial zone to the spirochetal infiltration zone, the amount or the number of bacteria increases, okay? So that might be an important MCQ again. So what is present in the bacterial zone? They are composed of large mass of bacteria with varying morphotypes, including some spirochetes. Next is the neutrophil rich zone, which consists of many leukocytes with neutrophils predominating. Bacteria, including many spirochetes, are located between the cells. Next is the necrotic zone, which is characterized by disintegrating cells and many spirochetes and other bacteria that appear to be fusiforms. Last is the spirochetal infiltration zone, which consists of spirochetes which are large and intermediate in size. No other bacteria were observed in this zone. Coming to the diagnosis now, how will you diagnose ANAG? So the main 3 important characteristic features of ANAG are gingival pain, ulceration, and bleeding. Now these signs will help you to differentiate it from other infections. Coming to the differential diagnosis, how will you differentiate NUG and primary herpetic gingival stomatitis? Now, which I will be talking to you in the next slides, coming slides. So, necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis is caused by fusospirochetes, whereas primary herpetic gingival stomatitis is caused by a viral infection, is of viral etiology. Okay, here you will see a necrotizing condition, but in primary herpetic gingival stomatitis, there is vesicular eruption. Also, here there will be pseudomembranous formation, whereas in herpetic gingival stomatitis, there is no pseudomembranous formation. Here the marginal gingiva is affected. Here there is a diffuse involvement of gingiva. Here in necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis, as I said, it is not contagious, whereas primary herpetic gingival stomatitis is contagious. Next, how would you differentiate it from desquamated gingivitis and chronic destructive periodontal disease? Now, necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis, as I said, is fusospirochetal complex. Chronic destructive periodontitis, bacterial smears may vary here, whereas desquamated gingivitis, very few bacterial forms are seen. Important difference here is acute necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis will give an acute history, whereas both desquamated gingivitis and chronic destructive periodontitis will give a chronic history. Okay, here there is a pseudomembrane. In desquamated gingivitis, there is no pseudomembrane, and chronic destructive periodontitis, you might see some purulent material coming out from the pockets. Okay, these are the main characteristic differences. Next, how would you differentiate it from diphtheria and secondary stage of syphilis, which occurs in the oral cavity? Now, NUG, as I said, again, fusospirochetal is the etiology. Diphtheria, cornybacterium diphtheria is the etiology. And secondary stage of syphilis, Treponema pallidum is the etiology. Okay. Here, marginal gingiva is mainly affected. In diphtheria, throat, fauces, and tonsils are affected. And secondary stage of syphilis, any part of the mouth can be affected. That is the main difference. Coming to the treatment of ANAG. So these are the 4 main important steps in the treatment of ANAG. First is the alleviation of acute inflammation by reducing the microbial load and removal of necrotic tissue. Second, it is the treatment of the chronic disease that is underlying the acute involvement. Third is the alleviation of general symptoms such as fever and malaise. Fourth is the correction of systemic conditions or factors that contribute to the initiation or progression of the gingival disease. So the treatment of ANAG occurs in a sequential manner. So in the first visit, what you will do is you will take a comprehensive medical history. Like you will ask about any systemic condition the patient is having, or any change in the lifestyle, or the patient's work condition. All these have to be thoroughly asked. After this, in the first visit, your main aim is to reduce the microbial load and remove the necrotic tissue to the degree that repair and regeneration of the normal tissue barriers are restored. So for this, what you will do is, first you will isolate the area with cotton rolls and you will dry that area. Then you will apply a topical anesthetic agent to that area because the patient will be in pain. You cannot do it without topical anesthetic agent. After 2 to 3 minutes, you will take a moistened cotton and you will slowly remove the pseudomembrane and the non-attached surface debris. After this, you will clean it with warm water and you will remove the superficial calculus. Now, patients with moderate or severe ANAG who have systemic manifestations, for them you will give an antibiotic course. So you will ask the patient to take 500 mg of amoxicillin every 6 hours for 10 days, or you can give metronidazole 500 mg twice a day for 7 days. Systemic complications will generally subside in 1 to 3 days. Antibiotics are not recommended in NUG patients who do not have systemic complications, remember. After this, you will give a few instructions to the patient, okay? So what are they? First is you should ask the patient to avoid tobacco, alcohol, and any condiments. You'll ask the patient to rinse the mouth with an equal concentration of 3% hydrogen peroxide and warm water. Remember, the percentage of hydrogen peroxide is important here and can be an important MCQ for you people. So 3% of hydrogen peroxide and warm water every 2 hours, or twice daily with 0.12% chlorhexidine solution. You'll ask the person to take adequate rest, pursue usual activities, but avoid excessive physical exertion or prolonged exposure to sun. Confine toothbrushing to just removal of soft debris with a bland dentifrice or ultra soft brush. Overzealous brushing should be avoided. You can give analgesics for pain relief. Now, patients who have systemic complications such as high fever, malaise, anorexia, and general debility who have been put on antibiotic treatment are told to have bed rest and have copious amount of fluid consumption and administration of analgesics for pain relief. After you give these instructions to the patient, you will ask the patient to come back after 1 or 2 days. So now in the second visit, that is after 1 or 2 days, you will again evaluate the patient for the amelioration of signs and symptoms. That is, you will see if the signs and symptoms have reduced. Then you will go ahead with scaling if necessary and if there is no sensitivity. Again, you will give the same instructions as given in the first appointment. Then you will call the patient again after 5 days, after the second visit. So during the third visit, that is approximately 5 days after the second visit, the patient is again evaluated for resolution of symptoms and a comprehensive treatment plan is made according to patient's periodontal condition. Now, patient is instructed about plaque control procedures which are essential for the success of the treatment and maintenance of periodontal health. The patient is then further counseled on nutrition, smoking cessation, and other conditions or habits associated with the potential recurrence. You will ask the patient to stop taking hydrogen peroxide rinses, and you can ask the patient to continue with chlorhexidine for 2 to 3 weeks. Further appointments should be scheduled for the treatment of chronic gingivitis, periodontal pockets, and pericoronal flaps, as well as for the elimination of all other forms of local irritation. Now, the patient should be reevaluated again after 1 month. Okay. Now, that time you will see how is the patient's compliance with oral hygiene habits, psychosocial factors, and the potential need for reconstructive or aesthetic surgery should be seen. So, what are the gingival changes which occur during the healing phase? So, first, when you remove the pseudomembranous layer, you will see that there is an underlying red hemorrhagic crater-like depression of the gingiva. Now, that shows that there is an inflammation caused by the necrosis and also that the tissue has lost the normal barrier function of the epithelium. That's why there's a crater-like depression. After this, in the next stage, when you see that there's decrease in the redness and the crater-like margins have reduced, that shows that there's a reduction in inflammation. That's why the redness has reduced, and also the reepithelialization of the surface has started. That's why the crater-like margins have reduced. Okay. After this, now when you, in the next stage, you will see that there are signs of restoration of normal gingival contour and color, indicating that there is a re-establishment of normal barrier function. Obviously, when the contour is restoring back, that means the normal barrier function of the epithelium has been restored. And if the color is being re-established, that means that keratinization has started taking place and also this further reduction of inflammation. Now, what are the additional treatment considerations? First is the contouring of gingiva as an adjunctive procedure. Now, healing often leads to restoration of the normal gingival contour. But however, sometimes what happens is there might be a shelf-like gingival margin which is created. Now, if this type of margin is created, that will favor the retention of plaque and recurrence of gingival inflammation might occur. So, to correct this, you will go ahead with periodontal plastic procedures, that is reshaping the gingival margin. Okay. Next, if the patient has recurrent infection, then what you should do? So then you will reassess for differential diagnosis to rule out the diseases that resemble NUG. You will see if there is an underlying systemic disease causing immunosuppression. You'll see if the local therapy you provide is inadequate. Okay, after you do all that, that is it with ANUG. Next, let's go ahead with primary herpetic gingival stomatitis. To start with, herpes simplex is an acute infectious disease which is probably the most common viral disease affecting the man, with the exception of viral respiratory infections, of course. The tissues preferentially involved by the herpes simplex virus, often referred to as herpes virus hominis, are derived from the ectoderm and consist principally of the skin, mucous membranes, eyes, and central nervous system. Now, we know that there are various herpes viruses, out of which herpes simplex virus is of two types, that is type 1 and type 2. Now, to remember, type 1 causes infections above the hip, whereas type 2 causes infections below the hip. Okay, so primary herpetic gingival stomatitis, which is an oral infection, is caused by herpes simplex type 1. Now, this occurs most often in children and infants below the age of 6 years. But again, it is also often seen in adults and adolescents. It occurs with equal frequency in male and female patients. So, let's see the pathogenesis of this. So, a susceptible host is required. Now, who is a susceptible host? Now, most of us get this infection before we are like in a very young age, before the age of 6. So, we have antibodies for it. But some people are not exposed to this virus. So, those people are the ones who are the susceptible hosts, who do not have antibodies. So, they, when come in contact with a person who has this infection, can get a primary infection. Now, again, this primary infection, only in 1% of the individuals it will show symptoms, whereas in 99% of the people it will appear as a subclinical infection. However, all the people are carriers for this virus and antibodies. Now, this virus in the body remains latent in the sensory and autonomic nerves, like in the ganglia. Now, when certain agents such as sunshine, fever, gastrointestinal upset, mechanical trauma, allergy, increased anxiety occur, these viruses become active, and then they cause recurrent manifestations which will occur in the form of fever blisters, genital herpes simplex, dendritic corneal ulcers. Again, they will shed viruses which will infect a susceptible host. That is the entire cycle of herpes simplex virus. So, what will the patient give you a history of? Now, patient will come to you saying that he had a history of fever, anorexia, and irritability before the painful oral ulcer started. So, when you start examining, what will you see? Now, primary herpetic gingival stomatitis appears as a diffuse erythematous tiny involvement of the gingiva and the adjacent oral mucosa with some degree of edema and gingival bleeding. So, in its initial stages, it is characterized by decreased spherical gray vesicles which may occur on the gingiva, labial and buccal mucosa, soft palate, pharynx, sublingual mucosa and the tongue. So, this is how it would appear like. So, you can see the grayish vesicles on the gingiva, tongue, labial mucosa. Now, that is at the initial stage. Now, what happens after 24 hours? After 24 hours, these vesicles rupture, okay, and they form painful small ulcers which have a red elevated halo-like margin and a depressed yellowish or grayish white central portion. They can occur in widely separated areas or in clusters. The important point over here is the disease course is limited to 7 to 10 days. Now, most of the other infections which resemble primary herpetic gingival stomatitis will not have this course. Okay, so this is an important differentiating feature. So, after 7 to 10 days, this will heal spontaneously and it will not result in any kind of scarring. Now, what are the symptoms the patient will tell you of? Now, the patient will have generalized soreness of the oral cavity, which will interfere with eating, drinking, and oral hygiene maintenance. Also, the ruptured vesicles are the focal sites of pain and are particularly sensitive to touch, thermal changes, foods such as condiments and fruit juices, and the action of coarse food. In infants, the disease is marked by irritability and refusal to take food. Coming to extraoral and systemic signs and symptoms, it will have the normal systemic signs and symptoms which any viral infection would have. That is cervical adenitis, high fever from 101 degree Fahrenheit to 105 degree Fahrenheit, and generalized malaise. Coming to the histopathology, the virus targets the epithelial cells, okay, which show ballooning degeneration. Okay, they show a balloon-like appearance, and also consists of acantholysis. Now, acantholysis is the spreading of the epithelial cells. Like the epithelial cells are no more fused together; they start moving away from each other. Also, you will see nuclear clearing and nuclear enlargement. Now, these cells are known as the Zank cells. Also, there is a characteristic intranuclear inclusion body known as Lipskut's bodies, which you will see on light microscopy. These infected cells fuse and form multinucleated cells. Also, you will see discrete ulcerations resulting from the rupture of vesicles, which have a central portion of acute inflammation with varying degree of purinal exudate surrounded by engorged blood vessels. So, now this is how the ballooning degeneration or the Zank cells will appear like. You can see that how they show a balloon-like appearance with an intranuclear inclusion body. How will you diagnose this? So, diagnosis is very clear. It is based on patient's history and physical examination. History is the history of any viral infection, and physical examination is vesicles followed by ulceration. However, if additional testing is required, you can confirm it by a direct immunofluorescent examination. Also, you can do a Zank smear for it. So, coming to the treatment. Now, if primary herpetic gingival stomatitis is diagnosed within 3 days of onset, you can give an antiviral like acyclovir, which you give as 15 milligram per kg 5 times a day for 7 days. If diagnosis occur after 3 days in an immunocompetent host, acyclovir therapy may have limited value. But why is this? Now, initially when you have a viral infection, the viral load is large. So when the viral load is more, antiviral therapy will work. But after 3 days, what happens is there is more of inflammation and cytokine production. Now that time, if you give an antiviral also, it cannot help much. So only within 3 days you can give an antiviral. After 3 days, you have to give a normal palliative care. You can also use barrier lip creams as petroleum jellies, which will prevent adhesion in patients with active herpetic gingival stomatitis. Now, what is the palliative care that you will provide the patient? So, you will ask the patient to take adequate hydration. You will give analgesics because the patient is having pain. And also, you will ask the patient to take good rest with good amount of nutrition and fluid. It is important to know that patients who are unable to drink or maintain proper hydration should be hospitalized. Okay. Other indications for hospitalization include immunocompromised children, patients who develop eczema herpeticum, and herpes simplex virus spread that is resulting in encephalitis. Now, studies have also shown that usage of acyclovir cream or oral suspension in a rinse and swallowing technique will help. Immunocompetent patients with significant pain or refusal to drink can be administered oral acyclovir if they present within first 72 hours of disease onset. So what are the complications of primary herpetic gingival stomatitis? That is, what will happen if they go unattended? So it will result in dehydration, which occurs in any viral infection. It can result in herpes labialis, which is a recurrent infection, herpes simplex virus encephalitis, herpetic whitlow, which are the lesions in the hand, herpetic keratitis, and eczema herpeticum. Now, how will you differentiate it from other lesions? Okay, so how will you differentiate it from erythema multiforme? Now, remember that erythema multiforme has these characteristic target lesions like those bull's eye. Now, those things are not present in herpes simplex infection. Okay, so that's how you would differentiate it with erythema multiforme. Also, the lesions in erythema multiforme are very, very extensive. Coming to bullous lichen planus. Now, in bullous lichen planus, there will be bullous formation, that is large fluid-filled blisters will be present along with lichen planus like reaction, that is these white striae will be present, which are not present in herpes simplex infection. Also, you will see excess keratosis, that is hyperkeratosis will also be seen. Now, how would you differentiate from recurrent aphthous stomatitis? Now, a recurrent aphthous stomatitis patient will not give you a history of any viral symptom, like he will not have fever or anorexia or any kind of malaise which are present in primary herpetic gingival stomatitis. Also here, in recurrent aphthous stomatitis, you will see ulcers which are not preceded by vesicle formation, whereas in primary herpetic gingival stomatitis, initially there will be vesicles which form ulcers. In desquamative gingivitis, you will see desquamation of the gingiva, which you do not see in primary herpetic gingival stomatitis. Last, talking about the communicability of primary herpetic gingival stomatitis, as I said, it is contagious, and that is how it spreads from one person to the other. Last, talking about pericoronitis. Now, what is pericoronitis? Now, pericoronitis is defined as the infection of the soft tissue surrounding the crown of a partially erupted tooth. This is most often or most frequently seen around the mandibular third molar, which is an important MCQ. It is also known as operculitis. Remember the other names, synonyms are very important to remember. Now, the soft tissue covering over a partially erupted tooth is known as a pericoronal flap or a gingival operculum. Maintenance of oral hygiene in such an area is very difficult to achieve by normal methods of oral hygiene. That is why it causes pericoronitis. It is most often seen in teen and young adults. The main age group is between 20 to 29 years of age. Pericoronitis is most often seen in vertically impacted teeth. Now, this is an important MCQ. So, they'll ask you which kind of impact, in what kind of impacted teeth are pericoronitis mostly associated with. So, they are seen mostly in vertically impacted teeth, followed by distoangular cases. So, coming to the classification of pericoronitis, according to the International Classification of Periodontal Disease, pericoronitis can be classified as acute and chronic. But remember, Carranza says it as acute, subacute, and chronic. So, what are these acute infections? Acute pericoronitis is of sudden onset. It is short-lived but having significant symptoms such as varying degrees of inflammatory involvement of the pericoronal flap. Also, you will see systemic involvement. Usually, the acute forms of pericoronitis is seen in patients having moderate or poor oral hygiene. Whereas chronic periodontitis or recurrent, in this type, the repeated episodes of acute pericoronitis occur periodically. It may have fewer symptoms, but signs are visible at the time of intraoral examination. The chronic type is mostly seen with good or moderate oral hygiene. So, what are the risk factors for pericoronitis? So, first one is presence of unerupted or partially erupted teeth in communication with the oral cavity, presence of periodontal pocket adjacent to the unerupted or partially erupted teeth, poor oral hygiene status of the individual, previous history of pericoronitis, or repeated respiratory tract infection and tonsillitis. Coming to the etiology of this, The most common cause behind the pericorneal inflammation is the entrapment of plaque and food debris between the crown of the tooth and the overlying gingival flap or operculum. Now, this is an ideal site for the growth of bacteria and it is difficult to keep it clean. Hence, it causes an inflammation in that area. Even in patients with no clinical signs or symptoms, the gingival flap is often chronically inflamed and infected and has varying degree of ulceration along its inner surface. Acute inflammatory involvement is a constant possibility and may be exacerbated by trauma, occlusion, or foreign body trapped underneath the tissue flap. So coming to the clinical features, how will they appear as? Acute pericoronitis is identified by varying degrees of inflammatory involvement of the pericorneal flap and adjacent structures, as well as it may have systemic complications. There might be inflammatory fluid and cellular exudate, which increases the bulk of the flap, and this may interfere with the complete closure of the jaws and can be traumatized by contact with opposing jaw, which aggravates the inflammatory involvement. The resultant clinical picture is it appears red, swollen, and there's a separating lesion that is exquisitely tender with radiating pain to the ear, throat, and floor of the mouth. The patient is extremely uncomfortable because of the foul taste and inability to close the jaw in addition to the pain. Swelling of the cheek in the region of angle of the jaw and lymphadenitis are common findings. Trismus may also be present. The patient may have systemic complications such as fever, leukocytosis, and malaise. This is how it would look like. You can see the flap over here. Underneath the flap, there might be food debris which is resulting in the inflammation of this flap. So what are the microbial flora commonly associated with pericoronitis? So mostly you will see Streptococcus, Actinomyces, and Propionibacterium species. Along with them, you might also see Prevotella, Bacteroides, Fusobacterium, Capnocytophaga, and Staphylococcus species. It is proven that the microbial flora of pericoronitis are predominantly anaerobic. Also, the pericorneal flap colonizes the same species which are seen in tonsillitis and periodontitis. So what are the complications of pericoronitis? So the involvement may become localized in the form of pericorneal abscess, or it may spread posteriorly into the oropharyngeal area and medially into the base of the tongue, making it difficult for the patient to swallow. Now, depending on the severity and extent of the infection, there is involvement of the lymph nodes such as submaxillary, posterior cervical, deep cervical, and retropharyngeal lymph nodes. Peritonsillar abscess formation, cellulitis, and Ludwig's angina are infrequent but a potential sequelae of acute pericoronitis. So finally, talking about how will you treat pericoronitis. Now, this is very common and you will meet such patients in your day-to-day life. So the treatment of pericoronitis depends on the severity of the inflammation. It depends upon the systemic complication and the advisability of retaining the involved tooth. So you start with gently flushing the area with warm water to remove the debris and exudate. Then you will swab with an antiseptic. You will swab the undersurface of the flap by gently elevating it. You will remove the debris underlying that area and you will flush warm water. After this, you will check for occlusion to determine if the opposing tooth is occluding with the pericorneal flap. If the opposing tooth is occluding with the pericorneal flap, you will either remove the soft tissue surgically or you will adjust the opposing tooth to alleviate the pain. Then you will prescribe antibiotics in severe cases for patients who may have clinical evidence of diffuse microbial infiltration of the tissue. If the gingival flap is swollen and fluctuant, that is, there is an abscess, you will do an incision and drain the abscess. Once the acute symptoms are subsided, you will check for the prognosis of the tooth, which is evaluated on the basis of the likelihood of whether the tooth will continue to erupt into the functional position or if the impaction and the factors predisposing to pericoronitis will persist or not. So the most common sequelae of this is bone loss on the distal surface of second molar. So if there is an impacted third molar, it will result in bone loss on the distal surface of second molar, which is a concern. So to reduce the risk of bone loss around the second molars, you should extract the tooth which is partially or completely impacted in its early developmental stage itself. If you're planning not to extract the teeth, then the pericorneal flap should be surgically reduced. Now, how would you reduce the pericorneal flap? Now, you cannot just merely remove the occlusal surface of the pericorneal flap. Now, if you do that, what will happen is there will be a distal pocket. There will be a pocket distal to the tooth, a deep periodontal pocket, which you will not be removing. That will cause reoccurrence of pericoronitis. So when you remove the pericorneal flap, you should remove in such a way that the distal portion of the flap is also removed. So you will give an incision this way, extending it distally, and remove this entire area and not just the occlusal surface. Now once you remove this, you will ask the patient to rinse the mouth with 0.12% chlorhexidine mouthwash or warm salt water rinses twice a day.